this event takes place within very, very urgent times. And I think it's so crucial to remind us of this, to give us a sense of urgency to act. When you leave here tonight, whatever you do, whether that is speaking in awareness of climate, speaking about people on the front line of the emergency, speaking about species who are going through the sixth mass extinction right now, every act counts. Many waves, lift all boats. Every action is really urgent. On that note, I will say tonight's structure is that Dale will be in conversation with Ava Santina Evans for about half an hour. There will then be 15 to 20 minutes of questions, and then we love you to buy Dale's book, and he will sign copies of the book. And just very, very lastly, Dale, thank you so much for being here. Follow you on social media, watch everything you do. It's, really inspiring. You're much needed. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ava, and I work at Politics Joe. I'm their political correspondent. So as we just heard, we're going to be doing questions. So I'm going to have a go at talking to Dale, and then whatever I don't ask, if you could please put your hand up and ask, that'd be great. And then we can have some actual journalism in here. That would be great. So if you don't know Dale, Dale is the founder of Britain's first renewable energy supplier. He's an incredible campaigner, as we've just heard, and he's written a book called Manifesto, which has now been, added to, hasn't it? You've added a few bits into it about how we can take this manifesto going forward. So we're moving into an election year. Who should we be who should we be putting our trust into? Who should we be... Do you know what? Dale, do you want to talk to me a little bit about Manifesto? Why did you write this?
All right. Thanks for that. Pass me the hot potato. I'll just start first maybe just by describing to you the really central premise of the book for me is that it sets out what I see as the overlapping crises that we face. The climate crisis we hear a lot about, the sixth great mass extinction of wildlife on our planet, we just heard about, and that's a real thing, and the human health crisis as well. And they overlap each other because our diets, the food that we choose to eat, is driving the extinction of wildlife, and it is driving the human health crisis as well. And the burning of fossil fuels is driving the climate crisis, but also a different kind of human health crisis in the poisoning of the air. And all of these things are just caused by two things, actually. The mass burning of fossil fuels, which is new, came around in the last couple of hundred years, and the mass farming of animals, which is even more new, just post the Second World War, industrial agriculture began, and we were eating vastly more animal products than we ever did before. And all we have to do is stop two things: burning fossil fuels and eating animals. That's the way I see it. Dead simple. These things manifest in three areas of life mostly, right? 80% of all your carbon footprints, the carbon footprint of every business, small or big, doesn't matter the size, every country, comes from three things: energy, transport, food. How we power ourselves, how we travel, what we eat. And we all make decisions every day, spending decisions in those things, and they're the things that we can do to change the way this world goes round. Don't know why I'm having trouble breathing. I've been doing a lot of talking today. So that's my background to the central premise of the book. And the book itself describes my life, which is, I'm going to say is a little bit crazy at times. I lived on the road for 10 years. I dropped back in to build a big windmill in the beginning of the 90s, formed the world's first green energy company, built Britain's first electric car, done all kinds of crazy things like make diamonds from atmospheric carbon and all kinds of other stuff. In my journey and through the work I've done using business as a tool to change the world, what I've discovered, the point we're at now, it's only very recent, is that we have all of the technology we need. The economics are on our side. The people are increasingly, we just don't have a government that gets it, which brings us right back to your point, where we are right now. It's an election year, and we have an historic opportunity to change everything by changing our government.
And that's a good point to bring up, that Rishi Sunak today has announced that we are going to be opening new gas power stations, which feels pretty important in light of what you've just said. So, how do we react to that?
Yeah, it's kind of like, I want to say I'm surprised. It's not quite the right word, because he's done some crazy things already before, like, announcing new oil and gas drilling in the North Sea, when finding more fossil fuels is described as economic and moral madness by the United Nations. And, it's against climate science, it's against economics, it's against good sense. But today's announcement, I think, was just pre-election manoeuvring, because the Conservatives came out and said, look, we're prepared to make the tough decisions we need to in the short term. We'll build the new fleet of gas-powered fire stations that we need, and so on and so on. This is a new problem. They created it today. They weren't talking about it yesterday, or for the last 14 years they've been running the country. Nobody's talking about it. The national grid that runs the grid in our country isn't talking about it. They say we can get to 100% renewable energy, no problem. And they don't say we need a new fleet of gas generators. So this is just designed for the election and for the Tories' position, which is anti-green, pro-fossil fuels.
I mean, the argument to assisting with the climate crisis that we are currently enduring, and also the energy crisis that a lot of people are having to endure, would be to build renewable energy in the country. And we have had a big row for the past 6 weeks about whether or not we should be allowing onshore wind. We've also been talking about the blight of solar panels up and down the country and how ugly they apparently are. I mean, where do you think this narrative comes from? Why do you think that the Conservatives would like to denigrate any form of progress rather than actually get on with it?
I think it's a new front in the Conservatives' forever culture war. They've focused on immigrants all summer, particularly small boat crossings. And it's out of all proportion to the impact of that route of immigration. By the way, if you look at statistics, firstly, to say Brexit was meant to stop people coming to our country, that was what it was sold on. Immigration doubled since Brexit, right? It's off the charts. Only 3.5% of people coming into our country are crossing the Channel. So why all the fuss? Why all the focus on it? This is what the Tories do. They try to divide us. And Rishi Sunak, I think, stumbled upon green issues last summer as a new kind of wedge issue, culture war issue. To be anti-green, he thinks will make him appeal more to certain parts of his party and possibly certain parts of the country. I think it's a very small audience. I think it's a very big mistake. He's putting clear green water between Labour and the Conservatives at the next election. He's going to make the choice easy, but that's what he's doing.
Let's come back to that in a minute, because I would like to follow that up. But in terms of it not being a common sense approach, the argument that the Prime Minister gave us today was that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and that means we need to have reserves. We need to be using fossil fuels in order to aid our transition to net zero. I mean, how true is that?
Again, it's not news, right? We know the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. We've known this for the 3 decades in which we've been pursuing renewable energy. And in that time, we've gone from 1% on the grid, less than, to nearly 50%. This is not a new story the Tories are sharing with us. We all know about this. The national grid knows about this. But the central argument they made today is that we need to build more new gas-fired power stations in order to back up the days when the sun and the wind aren't there for us. It doesn't make any logical sense when you think about it, because the gas power stations we have today can do the job when we have nearly 50% green electricity. As we build more green electricity, we use gas less, but we still have the capacity to do today's job in the future. We don't need to build new ones, we just keep the ones we've got, and we use them less. So it's a completely false argument to say we have to build new ones to back up renewable energy, because the amount of energy that we're consuming isn't growing massively. We aren't trying to cater with a new demand. We're catering actually for a growing contribution of green energy and a shrinking one of gas, but without taking away the capability to turn them up when we need to. And I go back to this one thing. The national grid don't expect we need to build new gas-fired power stations. We have many other ways to control the balance of the weather and demand and that kind of stuff.
A lot of the concern that comes through the conversation about transitioning to green energy is that it's extremely expensive, not only for the public purse, but also for working class people, because if you want to transition to an electric vehicle, you would need to get rid of your petrol car and purchase something new. I mean, who really is paying the cost of it? Is it as expensive as the Conservatives tell us it will be?
It's another false narrative, actually, that we can't afford green policies, that they cost us more than brown policies. They don't. And I mean, if you look at energy, for example, our onshore wind has been banned for 10 years, but onshore wind and solar need no money from the government because they make the cheapest form of energy that we've ever known. And solar is being built right now without any public money. We're doing that. And if wind was unbanned, we would do that as well. So the argument that green electricity costs us too much is utterly, utterly false. If you look at electric vehicles, the cost of ownership of them is lower than a petrol or diesel car now, even though they cost more to buy, because they cost so much less to run. And so if you're lucky enough to have one, you're spending less on fuel. The more people buy new ones, the more second-hand ones are in the market. It doesn't make any sense to push out the ban on diesel and petrol cars beyond 2030. But the motor manufacturers themselves said that these cars will be costing the same in 2030 anyway, diesel or electric, at which point it's a no-brainer if you're going to buy a new car, and only 20% of car sales in our country every year are new anyway. Not everybody's running around trying to buy a new car, especially people struggling with the cost of living crisis. And when Rishi Sunak announced his policy to push back the ban date, he said it was to help people struggling with the cost of living. It doesn't make any sense, because people struggling to pay bills don't worry about buying a new car.
And in terms of how ready we are for a transition to electric vehicles, because that was another argument that was given to us by the Prime Minister, that he needed to move it 5 years later, the deadline to give up to sell petrol vehicles, because we simply do not have the capacity to charge them. People won't be able to travel the country. But you were a pioneer in that field. You were the person who fitted charging points up and down the country. So is that point a moral panic? Or have we simply lapsed a bit in our construction since you were overseeing it?
Yeah, I'd like to say it's the latter, but it is not. It's got better since I stepped away. Because the people that took over had much more money, and they've done a fantastic job. And this is just an argument, again, that's used by the Conservatives, that it bears no scrutiny. Right? Who here has an electric car? Quite a few people. I mean, the infrastructure, I drive up and down the country sometimes, not all the time. There have never been more pumps, as I like to call them, electricity pumps. Never been more of them on the motorway, ever, and they're super high powered. A car today will typically have a 300-mile range. When we began in 2010, it was like 80 miles. And today you can find a 350 kilowatt charger which will put 100 miles in your tank in 10 minutes. When we began, it was a 3 kilowatt charger. It was actually a 3-pin plug on the motorway. The game has changed. And then if you look at the statistics, 99% of all car journeys in our country are less than 100 miles. And there is an amount of range anxiety that people have. Or if I can't do 500 miles, there's a problem, without stopping. Right? But there's a problem there anyway. You've got a very strong bladder if you can drive 500 miles without stopping. The typical dwell time stopping at a motorway service station is the time in which you can charge your car. It kind of fits.
I have range anxiety. I don't ever go anywhere, and if I do, it's by train, but I have range anxiety all the time. Let's talk a little bit about your work in campaigning. So last year you were donating to Just Stop Oil, and their cause was one that you really felt for. I mean, we could see you all over broadcast, talking about them, talking them up. What was it that attracted you to them at that point in time?
Well, I think it was a really simple campaign. Single purpose, summed up in the name of the campaign, although it got a bit confusing at the end because politicians chose to interpret it as being the call for the end of all oil rather than no new oil. But it was a simple message, simple campaign, super sensible. I thought they would be knocking on an open door, actually. A government that signed the net zero bill into law, for example, and had been burnishing its green credentials for quite a while, you'd think they would say, look, that's fine, we're not going to drill for new oil and gas. It doesn't make any economic sense anyway. And we don't have much left in the North Sea. There's about 10% left of what was ever there. And that's all there is. It doesn't make any actual sense. But instead, it got taken and used differently as a weapon to attack Labour with, because I had a foot in both camps, supporting Just Stop Oil and supporting Labour. And it became what it was. But they're lovely people as well, passionate, so concerned about the environment they're willing to put themselves in harm's way to do something about that. I joined them on a march around London, around Parliament Square, and it was just a great eye-opener, because the protest begins by stepping out onto a pedestrian crossing when it's green for go. And then you just stand there in the middle of the road and wait for the lights to change when the traffic then wants to move, and you just stand there. And all of your senses are saying, get off the road. This is not what you do, is it? You get off the road. And instead you start walking very slowly down the road, and they kept having to pull me back and say, no, slower, walk slower. I'm trying to get out of the way of the traffic. And, we had a bit of fun there for an hour or so, and the cops were decent and that kind of stuff, and we got support and abuse from passers-by in roughly equal measure, I would say. But great people, great purpose and cause, and real commitment.
You've had quite a lot of experience with the police and protest. I think during your time in the 80s, when you were a New Age traveller, you often ran into the police, and were they just as kind then as they are now?
No, I'd say invariably not. And on this protest in London, the organisers of the march, they said to me, the cops are being super nice because you're here. They would have arrested us all by now, and they were leaving us alone. So I guess that's a big change.
Can you talk to me a little bit about your time when you were a New Age traveller? Because in the book you talk about how that inspired you. Well, not inspired you, I think that feels a bit flat as a word, but that made you realise that you needed to take the climate seriously. So what part of that bit in your life moved you towards that way of thinking?
I would say my time on the road equipped me for what I did next. It gave me a lot of self-confidence, self-reliance. I learned a lot of skills. I was my own plumber, electrician, not really carpenter, but I did all kinds of stuff. I learned to weld and build engines and build trucks, all that kind of stuff. And so when I dropped back in at the end of the 80s, early 90s, I was more equipped than your average person to try and start a business, I think, particularly one in an entirely new industry, which wind was at the time. And I guess particularly coming from a background of like having nothing, I literally lived in a trailer on the hill and had this idea that I could build a big windmill there, but I had no training, qualifications, no money, or anything like that. So it was a massive challenge, but I didn't think twice about it. The Epiphany was me up on the hill one day thinking that I could spend another 10 years living this low-impact lifestyle myself, or I could drop back in and try and build a big windmill and change how energy was made. And that was an easy choice for me.
But that's what's really confusing to me, because I don't know about how many of you do any kind of, this sort of work at home, but I never pick up a hammer. So, one day you're living in a trailer, and then the next day you are building a windmill that is going to power something. How do you know you can do that?
Well, I guess I didn't. But I thought that I needed to. I thought it needed to be done. And I just set about learning everything I could about wind energy. It was a completely absorbing thing. And it took 5 years to build the first one. But I started by learning about the wind, because you need to measure the wind on your site to know if you've got enough wind to make an economic job of putting a windmill up. And I needed a mast for that. I didn't have the money, so I made one and put that up. And that turned into a small business making masts for other people, which then paid for me to carry on with the next steps, which was like how does planning work, environment impact assessments, grid applications, finally a business plan to go to the bank. And I'd raised by then the 20% that I needed so that I could borrow the other 80%. And it all just kind of came together over a very long period of time. And we built it.
But you don't like being called a businessman, despite you keep repeatedly saying that you work in business. What's the difference?
Well, the difference is one of purpose, I suppose. I chose to use business as a tool to try and change things. I think most business people are in business for a different reason. I like to express it as a question. Do you live to eat, or do you eat to live? And I eat to live. And our business eats to live. We do make money, but we keep that money in the business. We're not for dividend. Our money goes into our mission. It's a very different thing. I think most business people live to eat. And it's a very different purpose and therefore very different outcome.
Okay, so you've built the windmill. You're now looking into grid applications. What then made you realise that you wanted to build charging points for electric vehicles? Because it's so ahead of its time. It's quite, Da Vinci. It just feels so out there. What made you think that needed to be implemented?
Well, I kind of bumped into it like I have done most things in my life. It was the early 2000s, and I remember writing a blog post saying that I thought I was a tree hugger and a petrol head, actually, because I'm a motorbike fan. I like fast cars and things like that. And I thought at that time to myself, I needed a new car anyway, and I should get a green one. And I scoured the world for an electric car, but there were none that you could buy. There were just none. And so just decided to make one. And the project began in 2008. It took 2 years because there was nothing out there that made the job easy. And we got the car on the road in 2010. And that experience of driving around an electric car when there were none on the road and no charging points made me realise that the big barrier to electrifying transport, which I already had in my mind, starting with cars, was that there was nowhere to charge. And in the early 2010s, around about 2011, we started the electric highway because we could see Nissan Leafs were on the road. You know, there was probably some dozens of cars on the road in Britain, but there was nowhere to charge. And there was a chicken and egg situation where people wouldn't build somewhere to charge because there weren't any cars, and people weren't going to buy cars because there was nowhere to charge. So we jumped in, stuck 3-pin plugs on the motorway network, and just got started.
And how did you go about convincing the right people that that was something that was important?
Yeah, that was probably really part of the magic of that, because it was so early days, there were so few cars on the road, but we managed to persuade every motorway service station landlord that it was important and that they should do it. And they did. You know, they gave us a lease, and that gave us the kind of runway to do what we did. Within 12 months, we had replaced our 3 kilowatt chargers with 50, and it just felt incredible. We didn't see it coming, but the technology moved really fast from there. And we sold it about 2 years ago, just after we put in 350 kilowatt chargers. In barely 10 years, we'd gone from 3 kilowatts to 350. I thought that was incredible.
So that sort of foresight with industrial planning, is that what you are hoping the Labour Party will have if they get into government?
I wouldn't claim foresight. I kind of stumble into things and do things because I think they should be done and I want them done. I never built a business plan for the electric highway. It lost money every year. For the first 5 years, we didn't even charge for charging. We just gave it away because it was cheaper than trying to charge people. And so I wouldn't claim foresight or planning or stuff like that. Just I'm a jump in with both feet kind of person, and I'm also pretty passionate that we get to a thing we call Green Britain, that we have a very sustainable life and have all of the benefits of that. Do I hope Labour will grab hold of this? Yeah, I do. And I do think they will as well.
It must have been quite disappointing for you when you began donating to the Labour Party more significantly, and they then reneged on their Green Prosperity Plan.
Yeah, no, I wasn't bothered actually, because I've talked about this so much today, especially.
No, he's even actually spoken about it to me, so he actually is already eye rolled. I could just see the eye roll.
Sorry about the eye roll.
It's like, again, really?
Sorry. I'll do this when I talk in future. Look, the 28 billion became a millstone around Labour's neck. They came up with it 2 years ago. It was very different economic circumstances. It comes from the Climate Change Committee, who said that's what we need to spend every year to get to net zero. When they did it, it was super exciting and bold. Today, the world is a different place. Our country is a different place. Our economy is in recession. Everything around us is on its knees. The Tories are lighting fires everywhere before they leave office. And Labour, I think, just did something sensible and said, look, we aren't going to commit to a number that we don't know we can deliver on. We'll see what it's like when the election finally comes, because it could still be almost a year before they get into number 10, assuming they win the election. So I had no problem with it. Plus, there are a whole bunch of things that don't need money. As I said earlier, getting to green electricity, 100% green electricity, doesn't need any public money. And then there are a whole host of other things that you could borrow to invest in, but there'll be projects that pay for their own debt, pay for their own interest, and make a profit for the country. They're good investments. It's how companies and economies grow. So there's nothing wrong with borrowing for good things. Borrowing for tax breaks, as Truss planned to do, and Sunak now says he's going to do, that's bonkers. So I'm pretty relaxed about it. I think Labour get the whole green economy thing, and I think they'll do the very best that they can do if they get in.
What should be a priority for them? If they were going to borrow to spend on something, what would you say is something they should go after?
I'm struggling, because I don't live in a world where I pursue things that need big subsidies. We've got this green gas program that we've aired a few times in public, and I was thinking then, maybe I'll say that, but actually, when you crunch the numbers, that doesn't need money either. I'm just struggling. I think we've probably been gaslit a little bit by the right-wing media and the Tories about this, and about the idea that this green stuff just costs money, right? Everywhere you look, it costs money. Everywhere I look, it doesn't. So I can't give you an answer.
What about in terms of, I know sorry, again, we spoke about this earlier, but I'm going to bring it up. We talked about NIMBYism, and we were talking about when you want to build these fantastic green projects, and when you want to have, onshore wind farms, or you want to have solar capacity, it's got to be built in someone's back garden, and that does upset people. People get, very up in arms, and actually MPs even win elections off the back of promising that they're not going to have ugly construction in their constituencies. But what would you say to those people? Do you think that their enjoyment of their natural back garden is more important than infrastructure, or is it the other way around?
I don't think that. I think that we live in a country where we share infrastructure, roads, hospitals, airports, ports, right? Everybody lives near something, well, nearly everybody. People deep in the country tend not to live near anything, but they benefit from all of the infrastructure that we have that supports our economy, that they might occasionally use to go flying or visit a hospital, whatever, but somebody lives near that. So I think it's a new situation where suddenly wind energy comes along. It's a technology suited exactly to the countryside, and it finds itself in the backyards of people that are just not used to having to live next to something. But having said that, I also want to challenge the idea that wind energy is unpopular. Because every opinion poll ever undertaken in our country since wind energy became a thing shows it to be around about 70% popular. The most popular form of energy that we have available to us, which is quite incredible. And when the government of Cameron, I think it was trying to force fracking on us all, fracking had exactly the opposite ratings. It was 70% unpopular. But Cameron and Osborne said, no, we have to have fracking, blah, 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 and local planning opinions don't matter and stuff like that. Eric Pickles said at the time, no means no for onshore wind, and no never meant no for fracking, for example. But we did all manage to stop fracking, which is a good thing. I just want to say also that most people think windmills are quite beautiful structures and they appreciate them for the job they do, and it's a media myth that they're unpopular, and that's why we can't build them.
Should we talk about something fun? In your book, there's a really fun bit, a few fun bits actually, about how you contest the right-wing media, how you challenge them, or how you beat them actually. And it's quite similar to what we heard earlier about this little pamphlet that is on offer here tonight, which basically gives you an idea of how you can challenge the sort of the normal kind of phrases you get thrown at you. So talk to me about Piers Morgan, and talk to me about his about him goading you for eating avocados even though you are a vegan.
I mean, it was quite hilarious. It's Piers Morgan's go-to kind of gotcha question. And I didn't go into it expecting it. I hadn't really thought about it. But I know that he likes to challenge vegans or people that, advocate, eco ways of living. Anybody on the alternative, compared to him, edge of things. And I forget what we were talking about originally, but then he just brought this up. He said, but do you eat avocados? And I said, yeah. And he said, then basically I'm a hypocrite because... avocado farmers, apparently, he said to me, murder billions of bees. And I'm like, come on. I think, murder's probably the wrong word. And billions? I mean, what are you actually talking about? And they do use bees in the pollination of avocado trees. I mean, that happens in commercial avocado farming. But he went on and on about this. I countered with, do you drink milk, actually? Because I thought, I'll just throw this challenge back at him. And I described to him, to me, milk is made from baby cow tears, right? Because the baby cows are taken from the mother so that humans can drink the milk. And I said, but you're okay with that, are you? Which he wouldn't answer. He kept coming back on the avocados. And then at some point he said to me, they're all made in America. Avocados all come from America. I said, I eat them, but I don't eat them from America. He said, well, you must do. They all come from America. He said, where else do they come from? I said, Spain. He said, how do you know that? I said, I can read labels. It was hilarious. And at the end of the show, we looked on his social media account, and his crowd, his followers, were slaughtering him. They were telling him he was finished, he was over, he'd been shown how to do this, that, the other. I don't know what it was. But, I mean, I quite liked chatting to him. He was quite funny. But then I did a quick Google to see where all the avocados in the world do come from. Only a fifth of them come from America. And I shared it with him on social media. He had no facts. The facts he thought he had were just rubbish. And he built his whole argument on that if you're a vegan and you eat avocados, you're basically a hypocrite, and you're not vegan because it involves the murder of bees.
Do you think he's ever enjoyed an avocado again?
Well, I have no idea. He did invite me back on his show, though, so he must have enjoyed it a little bit.
So this also leads into how you not only are you very good at challenging the right-wing narrative, but you also use it to fuel your next projects. So you've got a project involving grass at the moment, and I believe the book explains that this stems from you always being thrown the line, well, what are we all going to eat if we're not eating animal products? Are we all going to eat grass? And, well, I think you actually are going to make us eat grass now. Is that right?
I am, that is my plan. and the actual argument goes, when you're talking about diet and stuff like that, often a kind of a point of retreat for somebody on the animal diet side of life will be, but we can't eat grass, so on marginal land, surely it makes sense to grow animals so that we can eat animals. You know, you can think there's some appealing logic there. My answer to that is no, we don't have to do anything with the land, we can let nature have it, right? But I wasn't really inspired by that, but it was in the back of my mind when I bumped into it as a possibility. So we've got this green gas mill in Reading. It uses grass to make gas. We published a study that shows we've got enough grass in our country to make all of the gas we need. We can create 160,000 jobs in the rural economy. We can create vast areas of wildlife habitat, 15 billion a year economic benefit, and zero carbon gas. So that's an aside. We built the first one. And I've kind of always wanted to do this. I bumped into a couple of universities that were in this field and said that they could make protein from grass. They could extract protein, not make it, just extract it because it lives there. And one of the myths of diet is that we need to eat animals because they make protein. They don't. We feed animals high-quality plant protein so that they grow, and then we eat them. But it's a diminishing returns business. 10 in, maybe 1 out if it's a cow, in terms of kilogram of food. So anyway, we started this project about a year ago. We've extracted protein from grass, and within a few months we're going to create a grass-fed burger, a vegan burger, and just do bigger things. There's 100 million tons of grass grown in our country every year, and we can extract protein twice as efficiently as a cow can from that grass, and with it we can make twice the protein that the whole country eats from every source every year. It's here with us right now. We don't have to grow anything new. We just have to stop feeding it to animals. And I love that. And we can make protein from our grass, and then we can make gas from it. And it's never before been possible to make food and energy from the same piece of land. But we can do that now. And I like to call it, I like to say actually, that we've reinvented the cow. And that's partly inspired by a clash online with Julia Hartley-Brewer. She's a right-wing radio person. You probably won't have bumped into her, hopefully anyway for you. And she once accused me of wanting to uninvent the wheel. She said, you eco people, you want to uninvent the wheel. I'm like, oh my God. I've been accused of wanting everyone to live in caves, but not uninvent the wheel. Because it's all about reinvention, right? The wheel has been continually reinvented since it was first invented. It's still round, but it's much better than it used to be. And we've reinvented the cow.
I actually prefer that we don't have 7 bins and everything else that you would like. Even as sensible as that might have sounded, I will stick to the future the Conservatives have promised us. Should we do some questions?
Thanks. Sam Baker. So Dale, I have to admit I haven't read the book yet, but I look forward to reading it. So just off the introduction to the book, I just had 2 sort of observations/questions. The first is people would probably add, or some people would add inequality to the crisis that we face. And some people would also add the hegemony of economic growth to one of the key drivers. So I'm just wondering where those 2 big topics sit in the book.
Yeah, that's fair. Look, I'm also a big advocate of social justice. There's a part in the book about tax and how that's an unjust system at the moment, how we can change that. But I honestly believe that we can't have true sustainability without social justice. But I think in the same way as the no-growth model, the conversations about this constant growth of economies that we're used to, for me, that's a secondary argument. The first thing we've got to do is green ourselves up, green up our power, our transport, our food. And then I don't think actually we're going to need the old model, the old way of doing things. Fossil fuels are a single-use fuel, so it's a consumable. We have to make more so that we can burn more every year. Renewable energy is a forever fuel. I think that will fundamentally change the economic outlook. But I think inclusion, social justice, all of those things are important, but I think they will come from a move to a green economy. I really do.
Do you think that's one of the concerns, just piggybacking onto that? Do you think that's one of the concerns, that if you've got social justice through sort of energy equality, then that doesn't work too well with a Conservative government?
I mean, it's possible. It always makes me laugh because it looks like there's a lefty-righty split in the world, not just in our country on this. You know, on the left we love windmills, you know, we love plants, we love animals and that kind of stuff, and we like being nice to people. And then on the right wing of life, you know, what do they love? They love building, you know, £100 billion nuclear power stations or whatever it is, you know, drilling and fracking like there's no tomorrow, and being mean to people, and you know, through the benefit system, through, I mean, the stuff our government are doing right now is just quite incredible on immigration and all the wedge issues they can find, right? Calling Palestinian protesters extremists. I mean, so it seems to me like almost there's a psychological split, right? If you're that kind of person, you're going to vote right, and if you're this kind of person, you're going to vote left. But I don't know. I haven't done any deep analysis.
Thanks. I also had a couple of observations and a question, building actually on that last observation of yours. I think the reason the right of the political spectrum favours fossil fuels over renewables, a large part of it, is that fossil fuels privatise profits and socialise costs, and the costs are enormous if you think about, I mean, the IMF estimates that subsidies for fossil fuels, the externalities globally, are about $7 trillion. That's in the latest estimate, and that's environmental externalities, of course, but it's also health externalities in the form of, you know, toxic emissions that impact people's health. So that never gets mentioned. That's externalised and socialised, and the profits are privatised. Whereas renewable energy, it's the reverse. You know, you have lots of examples of communal schemes for renewable energy where the benefits are socialised, and there are no externalities. There's no environmental cost, and there's no health cost. So I think that's a fundamental point that is never mentioned, and I don't understand why it's not more prominent in the media debate. A second observation would be that, and this reinforces the point you made very eloquently in your answer to Ava's questions, that renewable energy is actually inherently deflationary, whereas fossil fuels are inherently inflationary, because the whole point of fossil fuels is you exhaust the resources that are easiest to access and therefore cheapest to access first, and then as you deplete them over time, you're moving further and further up the cost curve, and technology can mitigate that somewhat, but the geology of fossil fuels is relentlessly inflationary, whereas renewable energy is exactly the opposite. We know where the wind blows, we know where the sun shines, you build the infrastructure, and you're capturing the energy at the source of capture, it's free. So the entirety of the cost for renewable energy is in the infrastructure that you build, and that declines over time, because as you build more, you get economies of scale and you get better at doing it. So that also, to me, seems to be an obvious point that should be made much more widely in the media, and never is, that renewable energy is inherently deflationary and fossil fuels are inherently inflationary. So it's just lunatic to say that renewable energy is too costly. Brings me on to my question / observation, where you're... Sorry. Ava asked you the question about what's the one thing you would do, or you would recommend that an income Labour government does. I mean, one thing that, again, doesn't get talked about enough in the media is the appalling housing stock we have in this country, the energy efficiency, the energy that we lose. And I think one thing an incoming government could do, and it's not really a subsidy because you get paid back over time, it's just that households have a different concept of internal rate of return or discounted cash flow than business, is to subsidise initially better insulation in the housing stock, the building stock generally in the UK, which I think has one of the worst in the whole of Western Europe. Is that something that, in the book, which I haven't read yet, but I've already bought a copy, I hope you'll sign it after this, and is that something you've talked to Keir Starmer about?
I haven't talked to him about that. I think you made a good point. It is one example of where we could spend public money, we could borrow to do that. We will eventually get a payback. It's longer than some other things, but it's an important thing to do. In all of the sectors of energy, transport and food, what I advocate is the same approach. Reduce what you use and reduce waste. They're slightly different things. And then what you do need, get from a renewable source. So it fits entirely with what you're saying. And your other 2 points are really good points. My approach to arguing for renewable energy tend to avoid the complicated, because in the media, there's not a lot of time for making arguments, and I don't think there's an awful lot of kind of bandwidth out there from people to understand them. The point you made are perfectly right, for trying to get them across to an audience, especially some of the audiences I've been with, like today, like, you know, I don't know, GB News or something like that, you know what I mean? My approach to the argument right now is to approach it from an economic point of view and to simply say we get twice as many jobs and GDP growth for every pound we spend on renewable energy compared to every pound we spend on fossil fuels. It's a simple, straightforward argument, and the fossil fuels can't win, and that's the case, and that appeals to the most people.
Did you ever support Insulate Britain? I mean, they've gone very quiet, as they've had to, because a lot of them are in court. But, I mean, is it something, that sort of group, that would you advocate for them coming back?
I don't know about coming back. I mean, what they did was incredible, you know, and I did support them, absolutely. I mean, again, so brave, you know, to sit and block a motorway and, you know, to do it in the face of great state hostility, which is actually what I experienced as a traveller on the road, hostility from the state, the Battle of the Beanfield, it's in the book. It was quite an eye-opener, actually, when you find yourself seen as an enemy of the state, which we were. But yeah, Insulate Britain, fan of them as well. A lot of the same people move between those movements.
Thank you. It's really interesting when we hear about Forest Green Rovers, and I love that story. And we had Helen last week at an event talking about it really enthusiastically, your colleague. I'm keen to understand, you know, you're talking about all these really important priorities and these things you've done. Why did you choose to go into football, and what do you want to do now? Like, what are your priorities when it comes to Premier League? Like, I live near Arsenal and Tottenham, and I know they're trying to steal some ideas from you, but like, where are your priorities or where you can go?
Well, our ideas are free, and I encourage them to take them, actually. They've certainly, Arsenal have taken our shirt design. That kind of agrees with me a little bit more, you know. But Forest Green was an accident for me. I didn't decide to go into football. It was my local club. I'd never been there. I barely knew of them, but I'd read in the local paper that they were on the verge of bankruptcy and relegation and stuff like that. And I went to see them, and long story short, at the end of the summer, they said to me, if you don't take the club over, it'll go bankrupt. And I was like, oh my God, I'm like way too busy for this. But it was 120 years old, big part of its community and all that kind of stuff. And so I said, how hard can it be, right? You know, I didn't plan it or think about it. And I jumped in, and it's been the most incredible journey. And what we discovered is that a football audience, they're just like you and me, right? Give them the information about what's wrong with the world and what they can do about it, and they pick it up and run with it. Our fans have got electric cars, they've gone veggie vegan, they buy solar panels. They tell me about it all of the time, you know, that what they're doing. So they haven't just tolerated our green approach, they've really embraced it. And we've got fan clubs in 20 different countries of the world. You know, Forest Green is a kind of global force. We've teamed up the UN on a Sport for Climate action program, which is based on our work. And our plan, to come to that part of your question, is to get to the championship and build a stadium made entirely of wood, the lowest carbon footprint stadium in the world ever. But I have to add the rider, since the Romans invented concrete.
Thanks. I'll stand up because I'm quite short. I was at a politics conference yesterday with about 2,000 other students, and less than 5% of them said that climate change and green issues were their number one priority for a future government. Why do you think this is, and what can we do about this?
It's a good question. I think that it's not just for students, but for a lot of people, there are more immediate concerns, and they do care about the climate crisis, and all of the opinion polls show the majority of people in our country do. But would they rank it number one in terms of who they're going to vote for, or you know, what they're going to do the next day? Probably not. Cost of living is a big issue, which is why I think we can fight and win this issue on an economic basis, because there are so many jobs in this transition to a green economy and renewable energy and all the other forms of greening up. Good jobs, long-term sustainable jobs. And that's the argument to be had with people, actually. I mean, Bill Clinton coined the term, it's the economy stupid, and you know, I would add to that and say it's the green economy stupid.
Not so much a question as an observation. You're beating Bradford 1-0, by the way.
Fuck. Oh, wow, I can't believe that. I forgot we were playing. That's incredible. How many minutes left?
About 84.
So I'm a big supporter of solar, wind. I get it. What I don't understand is why tidal doesn't work. And is it technology? Is it environmental impact? What is it that's holding us back on tidal?
I think the technology's there. If you think about it, it's one of the hardest ways to make electricity underwater. I mean, a submarine is the most expensive kind of boat that we can make, right? And to put an electricity generator in a submarine and make it work, that's always going to be expensive. And so the tidal stream concept, approach to tidal, does work. It's just very expensive. We've got one, I think I talk about it in the book, called Tidal Lagoons. And in it, you build a rock or a concrete wall. It's a rock wall, really. You impound a body of water, and you have turbines in the rock wall. And when the tide moves in, you make electricity. Then you shut the gates, keep the water. When the tide drops outside, you let it back out again. So you get, quite a few goes at making electricity every day. It was tried in Swansea, the Swansea Tidal Bay Lagoon, whatever it was called, failed to get public government money. It wanted an enormous sum of money, more than Hinkley, which was the most expensive electricity that we've ever seen. And the reason for that is to get around the IP of the offshore concept, they attached it to the shore and they created a swimming pool, in effect, with a deep end and a shallow end, and it just destroyed the economics. So we've done a lot of studies up the west coast of Britain, and we think that tidal energy could be generated for even less than onshore wind and solar. And once you've built it, it's there for 100 years. You change the turbines periodically, but the infrastructure's there for 100 years. And if you build a series of them up the coast, the tide moves up the coast, so you get this generation moving up and down the coast. And to a degree, it's storable. For a couple of hours, you can hold it and let it out when you want. So we have a great asset in the smart grid that we need to balance all of this stuff out. So I think tidal's got a lot to offer. We're trying to get one to the point of pre-planning, so that we've done all of the assessments and stuff, and we're ready to go for planning in maybe the next 12 months. And I'm hoping that a new Labour government will look at it and help us make it happen.
Hello, my name's Sarah Lennon, and I'm a supporter of Insulating Britain and Just Stop Oil. So I'd like to say we've passed 1.5 degrees of heating. The last 6 months were 1.7 degrees above the pre-industrial average. We're looking at 2 degrees in the next 15 years. So what we're looking at, it's not about electric cars or even your 7 recycling bins. What we're looking at is how we're going to feed ourselves in the future. And I have no faith that any politician in this country really gets any of that. In fact, I don't even think I really get what's coming and what we're facing. So is there any possibility in this world that when we get the next Labour government that they will do something radical, like setting up a standing deliberative democracy, a standing people's house, that will actually look at some way of mobilising this country for what's coming, for what we face? Because the current economic system is going to collapse. It simply cannot deal with 2 degrees of heating. So how do we find ways to protect ourselves in the future?
Hang on, pull back a little bit on that. When you talk about mobilising people, what do you mean? Like, do you mean getting people ready for an inevitable disaster? Or do you mean actually working to tackle it?
What I'm talking about is a countrywide mobilisation, like we saw in 1939 to fight World War II. We mobilise everything and everybody. It's not a wartime economy, it's a climate economy.
Are Labour going to do that?
I have no idea. First thing I should say is I don't speak for Labour, just in case there's any press here. There probably aren't. But I don't speak for Labour, and I genuinely don't know. And for many years, I've had this same view, Sarah, actually, that we did incredible things in a time of war in terms of focus and outcome, and we just need to tackle the climate crisis like that. And it's a bigger threat than the war was, actually. It's a planet-wide existential threat. I'd like to see us do that. I don't share the dire outlook. You know, that I don't share that. But that's because I'm just like naturally optimistic. I still think there are things we can do. We have so many answers. 80% of our food currently is imported into our country, for example. If we make protein from the grass that we have an abundance of, we could be an exporter of protein. We can make twice as much as we need to eat. And so there's a lot of scope within those numbers for there to be a decline in the growth of things because of the climate crisis, and we can still feed ourselves. That's what I think. But the biggest thing we have to do, the first thing we have to do is cut emissions. That's such a big deal. Stop burning fossil fuels, stop eating animals. Do you eat animals? Good. So many environmentalists do. And people that love nature. And I say to them, but if you eat animals, you're eating nature. Don't you understand that?
Thank you. A slightly lighter question. I'm just reading there's a new history of rave which talks about the New Age and the Battle of the Beanfield, etc. I'd just love to know if that's something that you've carried on, because in the book there's a lot of people were in that scene and then basically got jaded or got into the big corporate stuff. How does that philosophy, early philosophy, kind of the early 90s stuff, feed into what you're doing now?
Well, I guess, I learned a lot of things on the road. I lived in Wales for my first winter, not in a house. We used to visit the local Whole Food shop, and there were like leaflets there talking about issues, lefty issues, I'm just going to say that. And, I kind of learned some fundamental things there. We used to sit around festival campfires, talk about stuff. I learned about food issues, veganism and that kind of stuff. And so it was a kind of like a learning experience. But I was predisposed that way. As a kid, it always bothered me, the kind of waste of life, the unsustainability of our approach to life. And I guess by the end of the 10 years, I'd evolved, like we all do. I had some new tools, some new abilities in terms of being able to build things as well. And I discovered wind energy. I had one on the roof of my trailer. I did a thing at Glastonbury called Wind Phone, selling wind-powered phone calls in the early 90s and stuff like that. So I was kind of like dipping my toe into more mainstream things, and I've still got my values from on the road, but actually I grew them on the road to an extent, because I was more or less a kid, and I'm still growing them today, I think, because the more I live, the more I learn.
Can I just go back to the tidal energy? Before I moved back to London, I lived in Wales myself, and I lived in this small community, and we had a Gwynedd hydro scheme. It was a community hydro where we got part of our electricity from the local river, and it fed back into the grid. What do you think about not just tidal energy, but drawing energy from local rivers, setting up small community schemes? I mean, why are these not more? I mean, they seem to be growing a little bit in Wales, but why are they not anywhere else?
I think river turbines work, but we're fundamentally challenged by the lack of resource. There are relatively few rivers that are suitable, and those that are have already been developed. It's just a resource issue, whereas we've got a vast amount of land on which we can build wind and solar. And by the way, we only need to use 1% of our land. Another myth of the right-wing agenda is that where we're going to fit them all. They say several things. One is we don't have enough wind and sun to power ourselves completely. And then they say, well, we haven't got the land to build them all. And then they say, but we can't rely on them. But we need 1% of our land, that's all. And 10% of it is currently built environment, something a lot of people perhaps don't understand. Especially if you live in a town or a city, you think everything's been built on. And if you drive down the road, you think everything's been built on, because what you can see from a road has probably been built on. But only 10% of our country has been built on, and only 1% of it needs to be given up for 100% renewable energy. And farming currently takes 75% of our land. And if we stop eating animals, we can give 75% of that 75% back to nature, which is 50% of our entire country.
We're running out of time, so we'll do a couple. Yeah. And then should we do the gentleman at the back as well afterwards, yeah?
I'm quite a hopeful person as well for solutions and better futures and things. One of the reasons we're doing climate emergency centres to focus on solutions. But if you were in a position of power in a future government, what do you think would be the top 3 kind of solutions or policies you'd like to see really focused on to kind of build it, bring in this sustainable future?
I guess my three areas of focus are energy, transport, and food. That's where 80% of the problems are. We've got all the answers in energy and in transport. The technology's there. In food, we don't need technology, actually. We just need behavior change. And I would focus on those. And we put out a mini budget last week in response to the Chancellor's not zero budget, and proposed 5 measures which will cost not a penny, but would save us £10 billion a year by making some tweaks to the energy system, sensible ones. £10 billion a year. So, you know, I'd be up for that kind of stuff. Stuff doesn't need money, makes an immediate impact, and then long-term energy, transport, food.
Thank you. So you were saying that we only need 1% of land, but we've got 71% of the planet is covered by water. So obviously, I think that it's a good resource. Water is a good resource if we can still use it, and it's a global resource. But what are your ideas on innovation for other renewables, not just solar, not just wind turbines? Do you see that there is a future for other renewables if they are if their LCOE competes with solar and wind?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other thing worth saying is renewable energy is a great democratizing force in energy. Fossil fuels are located in just a few parts of the world, in the hands of some, on the whole, not very good people. That market is rigged, price-wise. Supply and demand is controlled to set the price where they want it. Wind and sun, the wind and sun, are available to every nation on the planet. It's a great democratizing force if we all shift over to being powered by green energy. I do support other forms of renewables. They do have to compete on cost, not always from day one. There's often a case to be made for an early investment to mature a technology. Tidal lagoons, they definitely look good. I'm a fan of the idea of geothermal. The problem in our country with our geology is that you have to drill too deep to get the heat out at the moment, unless we come up with some better or cheaper ways to drill. But I love the idea of repurposing thermal power stations, which is what a gas-fired power station is, right? It boils water. To repurpose that, keep the infrastructure, the grid connection, the generating halls, the turbine halls, all that kind of stuff, but just drill down into the hot water in the center of the earth, or not quite the center, you know what I mean, and turn it into a geothermal power station. I love that idea.
Great, well, thank you very much for coming. Dale is going to stay and he's going to sign a few books just on the right here, and they're selling books from a local bookstore. It's very nice to support local. And yeah, definitely read the book. I haven't done a very good job of interviewing him because there is so much more in there that you should read. There's some really lovely anecdotes, and it's a really, really good read, and I'm not just saying that. So thank you very much for coming.